There are reports suggesting that Cabinet has pushed back on National Treasury's plan to cut spending on government departments. According to the Mail and Guardian, Minister in the Presidency Khumbudzo Ntshavheni has already suggested that the plan would not go ahead as Cabinet is not looking at cutting the budget for specific projects. Khaya Sithole is an independent analyst and he joins us now for more on what we can look forward to. In particular, Khaya Sithole, the medium-term budget policy statement that will be delivered by the Finance Minister moving from October to November. How would you characterize South Africa's fiscal position?
Good afternoon and good afternoon to the viewers. So unfortunately, the country's fiscal position is quite bleak. And I think obviously at the core of the problem is probably many years of spending that has not yielded the right outcomes. And when we talk about spending yielding the right outcomes, it's really a question of if you're going to borrow, do you borrow to invest or do you borrow to pay for past sins? And South Africa hasn't got that right balance over the many years where the spending has essentially gone in the wrong direction. Obviously, the one way to solve this is to either increase taxes or to borrow more money. But it's become very clear that obviously the capacity to increase taxes is severely limited. And of course, borrowing to pay for past sins is not desirable. So the squeeze that we're now hearing about is probably the net result of the many years of probably the wrong decisions being taken on the country's spending patterns and priorities.
What are some of those wrong decisions?
So I think one of the biggest ones that always gets mentioned is obviously the civil service wage bill, in that in instances where the government has said that, look, we are budgeting for a particular, increase, and then in the negotiation process, they have to yield and actually pay more. It simply means that we have many more unfunded budgets in that sense. So the problem with unfunded budgets is that you then have to redirect spending that was supposed to go elsewhere in order to cover those particular unfunded budgets. And I think the persistence of the unfunded mandates, whether you see it as the civil service wage bill and also other issues that have emerged that were unplanned for, has created this particular squeeze, which then pushes National Treasury to say, look, guys, the only way in which we can do this is for you to redirect spending elsewhere. And of course, that is something that you're always going to expect resistance from ministers and their respective departments.
Let's expand on that when you speak of resistance when it comes to those austerity measures, at least. I mean, when President Cyril Ramaphosa rose to the position he is at today, he spoke about addressing that issue, the ballooning spend on public servants. And so has it just become another buzzword when we speak about austerity measures? Because implementation, it would appear from the outside looking in that is almost near impossible.
Well, it's a very difficult one because obviously every single department, believes that the things that it asks for to be funded are things that are priority areas. So it's never an easy conversation to say, look, we think you guys must take a haircut here and there, because that simply means that what their own annual performance plans or their spending priorities then have to be redirected or reshuffled somehow. So you always imagine that every single department will say, wait, hold on, why do we have to be the ones that make this particular sacrifice? And I think the trade-offs that are obviously involved in the budgeting process are never easy. And also, especially ahead of a general election, it becomes even more difficult for government ministers to accept those decisions or accept those directives from National Treasury, because then obviously there's always a question of, well, at what cost are we doing this, and does it not essentially amount to self-sabotage by a party that is in government when it then starts cutting spending or redirecting or sacrificing some priorities ahead of a general election. So it's never an easy conversation, but it's the type of conversation that National Treasury is duty-bound to have with multiple departments. And of course, the resistance may indeed be strong enough for them to be told that, look, we're not going to do that, so you need to go and raise more money. Either you come up with a new tax plan or you actually go and borrow more money. So at the end of the day, the decision has to be made, and I think the president is probably going to be the one person that actually then has to swing the pendulum in one way or the other.
We'll take a look at the new tax plan or the suggestion of a new tax plan, but when it comes to the issue of cutting government departments, as we speak, can we afford not to? And I know it's a very difficult one, but I guess in trying to answer that question, is the output worth the cost?
So it's always a tricky one because you then have to go back to the president's own statements. When he started, obviously, in your union buildings, he did mention that he probably had a desire for a different way of government or a different structure in government. So, of course, then the question must become, well, what exactly has he done since then in order to reconfigure the state? Do we have far too many ministries, for example, or do we want to reconfigure or absorb some of them? The closest we've got to that is obviously the conversation that is ongoing about the fate of the Department of Public Enterprises, which is due to be abolished so that all the entities under that currently report under it then get absorbed into their home ministries, if you can call it that. So that seems to be the only step, but even that, it's still at the talking stage rather than the implementation stage. So at the end of the day, it really comes down to President's own commitment that he mentioned when he started in 2018, and whether he actually has the political appetite to actually implement that. And the evidence over the past 5 to 6 years indicates that it's not very easy to do these things, even if he is committed to them. Because,
Khaya Sithole, are you not able to absorb other departments into other areas of government, right? Because here you sit with a Department of Energy, you sit with an entire energy minister that also has his own team and his own contingent. Some departments in terms of the work speaking to each other almost.
Yeah, so obviously for a lot of people it's never been very clear what the basis for creating some of these ministries were, and I think obviously we do now know with the benefit of hindsight that some of them were created in order to solve political problems rather than as questions of practicality. So I think in the question of them trying to figure out what should fall in when, it's simply a matter of will the president have the capacity to come back to some of his cabinet members and say, actually, we don't think that there's a justification for keeping this ministry in its current form, so therefore perhaps you need to go back to Parliament and become a backbencher. It's not an easy conversation. It's politically sensitive, and I think ahead of a general election, the appetite for doing such things is even more diminished.
You spoke of a new tax plan. What does that look like to you? Because some pundits are pointing to perhaps Treasury implementing a 2% VAT increase. For you and I, what would that mean? South Africans who are already pinched.
The problem with VAT is that, unfortunately, it's the most regressive of all the taxes because it affects the poor disproportionately. So the issue that has been put on the table is really the issue of if the government is going to persist with some of its spending priorities, like the social relief for distressed one, for example, the money has to be raised in one way or another. And obviously, when they look at the other taxes that are available, they would have done some particular permutations and particular calculations and then zeroed in on the one that they think is practical. And unfortunately, it looks like VAT has emerged as the one that is more likely to be changed rather than the other forms of taxes. The consequence of that is that the cost of living squeeze that we've all been living under, and obviously the low incomes that people have been subjected to since the pandemic, it's only going to make the situation worse. So it's undesirable, but unfortunately somebody has to make the tough decisions, and if the tough decision is that the VAT must be increased, we all just have to bite the bullet.
Sure. There's also the aspect of unions who will also argue that, well, if government departments are consolidated, there are some people who might fall off, or if there are budget cuts, there are people who might fall off, or adding to an already burdened state in terms of the unemployment rate.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the great tragedies that we have, in that obviously as soon as you start contemplating governments cutting their spending, there will be casualties, and the casualties will not only be in the form of services and service delivery mandates and also some of their own performance mandates that those departments have. There will also be casualties in terms of an increase in the number of people that they have to lay off. And unfortunately, when you have such a high unemployment rate, that is completely undesirable. But I think it is essentially us paying for the consequences of the mistakes and the errors of the past.
You have the so-called, errors of the past?
So those are the ones that I mentioned earlier on, in that obviously because we haven't grown the economy to an extent that enables us to spend as we wish, it simply means that we always have to make particular sacrifices, and this is the time when sacrifices have to come, and they are never a palatable conversation, but it is a necessary conversation.
You've also got the so-called illicit economy, which is apparently thriving, and so when you take a look at South Africa in the near term at least, what are our prospects? What does it look like?
Yeah, that one is a very difficult one to crystallize, because obviously what you want to be able to do is to figure out how to address some of those leakages that we see. So in some of the data that gets mentioned indicates that there's a lot of money that is essentially outside of the formal nets. And if it's outside the formal nets, it means that we don't collect the taxes that we should be collecting, and we obviously don't understand the entire size of the economy. So it is a matter of the law enforcement having to do the right things. It's a matter of us understanding exactly how these illicit money flows occur and how to stop them. And so far, we probably haven't got the right model for that. So it's still an ongoing problem.
How's that going? Are we, especially with the South Africa being greylisted?
It's not easy. It's not easy at all. And I think obviously one of the consequences of the greylisting is that you then have to be more proactive in tackling some of those particular issues. And of course, the fact that we got greylisted means that the assessment of the FATF was that we hadn't done all the things that needed to be done. It is an ongoing conversation, and obviously National Treasury and the Reserve Bank are working to try and address some of those issues. There are some meetings that are coming up with the FATF, and then obviously we're hoping that there'll be a future assessment that then tells us how far we progress. But until that happens, it's definitely a matter that requires the attention of the highest levels of government officials, and we're hoping that they're doing their job, but we don't know yet.
Just finally, which countries have been here before, especially with some of the nuances when we speak of the public sector or the over-bloated public sector? Which countries have been here before, on the continent more so, but have managed to turn the tide or are managing to turn the tide by making unpopular decisions for the long term?
Well, I think every country probably has to balance its political considerations and its economic fundamentals. So every single country will decide at any point in time what it thinks that decisions that can be made that can be accepted to the electorate on. And of course, the countries that make the wrong decisions are the ones that then face the type of revolt that you see on the ground. But I think in the South African case, we obviously have to be very clear about what our unique circumstances are, what our own contextual factors are, and then make the decisions that fit the South African narrative. It's very difficult to sort of make direct comparisons with every other country, because when decisions have to be made and tough decisions have to be made, the balance of considerations varies from country to country. And I think in the South African context, it's very clear that with the high levels of unemployment that we have, for example, and how reliant we are on government being a big spender in the economy, we have to make very difficult decisions about how to manage that. And I think if we get it wrong, we obviously are going to suffer consequences of increased unemployment, for example. But if we get it right, then perhaps in the long run, we'll see the benefits of it all.
Fair enough. Khaya Sithole is an independent economist. Thank you very much for your time.